everyone, and welcome to my holiday cookie tutorial. I'll be showing you how to decorate 5 beautiful cookies for the holidays. So let's get right into it.
Now are you, dear old man, whisper what you bring.
For our first cookie, we're going to decorate a Christmas tree. There's a lot of texture and dimension to it, and it's beautiful. So the first thing we're going to need is really stiff royal icing. So if your outline consistency is not stiff enough, you can add a few spoons of powdered sugar and stir it in. Make sure it's nice and stiff so that it holds its shape really well. We want those little grooves from the star tip to stay there. We don't want it to melt back to each other. So I'm going to grab my Wilton tip number 21 and just give a few practice goes on a paper towel. So here I can see if my icing is too thin or thick and make sure everything's okay. So what you want to do is hold your bag up and squeeze, and as you squeeze you want to pull your bag down a bit and then go right over top of where you just piped and go a little bit quicker upwards. So you kind of pipe pressure down slow and then go up quickly, and that's the motion that you're going to do on the tree. So once you have that down, we can move on to our cookie. Now we're going to start with the trunk here, and I'm just using my outline consistency, and I'm just kind of scribbling back and forth with my piping bag just to fill in that section. It doesn't have to be smooth or anything. I want a little bit of texture on here, so this works perfectly. Okay, so now we're going to start with our tree. So again, we're using that same motion. I start piping and I go down and overlap, come back up, and then let go of pressure as I'm going. You kind of get into a rhythm, and I'm just following the shape of the tree. If you feel like you need a little more piping here or there, just feel free to add. And I'm starting for the bottom so that my layers layer nicely as I go up. And then once we're done that, we're going to add a few sprinkles to it. You can, again, use any color you want. I think it just adds a little bit of extra fanciness to it. And then we're going to use our outline white consistency and add a few squiggly lines here and there just to mimic some fresh snow. And that's it. It's super, super easy and quick, and it's such a beautiful Christmas tree. Alright, for my second cookie here, we have our Pinecone cookie. So I'm going to outline my cookie with my white outline consistency. That just means that it's a thicker icing. So when I pipe this line, it stays in that line that I'm piping. It doesn't melt into the cookie. Circles are really hard to get perfect. So if you want to go clockwise or counterclockwise, some people find it more comfortable to go the opposite way. And always look a little bit ahead of where you're piping. Don't focus on where the piping icing is landing. Just look a little bit ahead and you will get a smoother circle. And then I'm going to go on to flood it. I usually like to let my outline dry for a couple minutes. So if I had a whole set of these, what I would do is outline all my circles and all the cookies that I need to with my white. And then I would come back and flood them all. So once I finished outlining everything, usually the first few outlines have dried enough that I can go in with my flood and continue on. Kind of saves you a little bit of time instead of just focusing on one cookie the whole time. This way, instead of waiting for other cookies to dry, you can do different steps at different times and, get more use of your time. So once I've flooded here, this is a larger cookie than I normally use. It's quite a big circle. And so I don't want to put too much flood and have it overflowing. So I left a little gap there, and I'm going to just fill it in with my scribe. If you don't have a scribe, you can use a toothpick as well, that's fine. Or you can give your cookie a good shake and shake out the flood and make it nice and smooth. And once this is done, I'm going to set it aside and let it crust over, let it dry. If you have a dehydrator or a fan, it probably takes about 45 minutes. You know, half an hour to 45 minutes depending. And if you don't, if you're just leaving it on the counter to air dry, then it may take up to, 2 to 3 hours to crust over enough for you to do the details. So now I'm adding my greenery. So I just put a line across the top of my cookie. And then I'm going to add little lines just to make the branch here. This is my outline consistency. Anytime you see detail work like this, where it's holding its shape, the icing is not melting, those are my outline consistencies. If you're finding that your icing is not sticking to the cookie well, then usually that means that your icing is pretty stiff. And that's okay if you don't feel like, adding a little bit of water and rebagging it. What you can do is you squish out a tiny little bit of icing on your bag, and then you make sure it's nice and secure when you touch down. And then as you get to ending your little line, you kind of scrape the tip of your piping bag against the cookie to secure it again. So almost like you're rubbing off the icing onto the cookie. Sometimes when your icing is really thick, it's almost dry, so it doesn't stick well. So that's a little trick that you can do if your outline is not sticking very well. Once you already have a layer of icing, so the first layer here I did, and I'm doing a second layer on top, because it's still a little bit fresh, the icing will stick better on that second layer. And you don't have to be perfect. I'm just putting a little pressure, moving my bag a little bit to make those lines. I'm not lifting up my bag too high. If your icing sticks or is not, coming out perfectly, don't worry about it. Nobody will notice with all the details after. So now that we finished that, we're going to move on to the pine cone. So I've flipped my cookie upside down because it's easier to do this way because the pine cone will be hanging off the branch. So we're going to start with the bottom of it. So here I'm just doing pressure piping. And what that means is I'm just holding the bag and squeezing really hard, and that accumulates the icing in these little balls here. And then I'm dragging the bag down once I finish. So I squeeze and then drag the bag down. And as I drag the bag down, I kind of wipe that tip against the cookie a little bit. You can see sometimes when I don't wipe it or, drag it too far onto the cookie, the tip kind of hangs off and that's okay, It's okay if you have a little tail there. It's okay if the line continues off to the next bubble of icing because it's going to be hidden anyways. As I squeeze, pressure, and keep the bag in the same spot, it makes that bubble, and then as I drag the bag down, I try to let go of the pressure a little bit so I get less icing coming out and I get those teardrop shapes. And so what I'm doing is just layering it on top. This is thick icing, and so I don't need to wait for it to dry. It's holding its shape. If you find that it's all melting together, that means your icing definitely is not stiff enough. So you need to add a little bit more powdered sugar and stir it in. So usually if that happens to me and it's not holding its shape, I'll take the icing out of the bag, stir in a little bit of powdered sugar, and then rebag it. As I'm getting to the top of the acorn here, I'm putting a lot more pressure and holding the bag a little bit longer. You can see it's a little bit slower, and that gives me bigger sections here. And I just keep layering until I get to the branch there. And then I'm just going to add a couple more branches here just to fill in the top and give it a little bit more detail. And again, I added a line, and then I'm just adding little lines or little V's kind of to this branch here just to fill it in. And sometimes, when you do one layer, if it doesn't look right, you just keep adding to it. And you kind of fill in a little bit of gaps. If it looks thin, you kind of keep going with it until you're happy. That's why I like this kind of greenery stuff. It always seems to look good no matter how much you mess it up. Sometimes my lines aren't straight, sometimes they're stuck to each other, sometimes, the piping bag, the stiff icing doesn't stick to the cookie, and, you just kind of make it work. And it always comes together really, really nicely because there's a lot of detail. And so, people don't really focus on the tiny little mistakes. All right, I just feel like I need a little bit more here at the top just to, secure it to the branch to make it look like a true pine cone. So I added one more dot of brown, and then I'm going to go in and add a couple of dots of red. Again, my outline consistency, and this just brings it all together and ties it nicely. And that is your pinecone cookie. Okay, now we're on to the present cookie. So I have my square cookie here, and I'm going to outline it in my outline consistency. It's a light brown tan color. And here I want to make sure I touch down my outline in each corner because I want a nice sharp corner. So I go from one corner to the next and touch down, and that gives me that nice angled corner. And once I let my outline dry for a couple minutes, I can go ahead and flood. And if you notice, my cookie has some nice, sharp, clean edges. So it's not kind of wonky looking. The cookie looks pretty square. So what I do sometimes, especially for these types of shapes that I want nice, I want it to look, really, really sharp. I want it to keep its shape. So what I will do is I'll take a microplane or, one of those little long graters, like you zest things with or so on. Those are great for cookies like this, and you just grate down the sides and it gives you a nice even edge, because usually squares or like rectangles, they don't really bake perfectly even. So you just do a little bit on each side until it's nice and straight, and it gives you a nice sharp edge. And here again, I'm just going to go in and flood. You can see my left finger against the bag to steady. And when you have smaller cookies, you don't put as much pressure, and if you have bigger cookies, you can put more pressure on the bag. It all really depends how big you cut the hole and so on. So your flood doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to fill in all the holes. If you miss a little spot, you just go in with the scribe and smooth it all out. And then we're going to do a branch. So here I have my outline consistency again. I'm doing a line so I know roughly where I want the branch to go. And there you can see my tip, the icing came out, but it didn't stick down to my cookie. And so I just wipe it off and I start again. So it happens, especially with stiff icing, sometimes it doesn't stick to your cookie. So I really want to make sure when I'm touching down on the cookie to start my line, really want to make sure I get the icing secured on there, and then kind of touching down again on the branch, that line that I drew. Sometimes it doesn't secure, you can see it kind of attaches, but I just keep going with it. I'm trying to keep this one clean because I don't want to layer too much on it. And I'm just doing really tiny lines, a little bit of pressure. I'm just going to go over it a little bit here just to thicken it up. But I don't want it too high. I don't want the layer too high because I'm going to do a detail on top at the end. I'm kind of going in between, if I can, the lines that I've already drawn just to fill it in a bit more. Make it look, I guess, a little bit more realistic. I usually don't like the first time I pipe it, and so then I just go on top and it seemed to look better to me. And now I'm going to take my white outline consistency and I'm going to touch down and go across the cookie as straight as possible. And then I'm going to go from top to bottom again, touch it down, lifting it up so I get a nice straight line, focusing on where I want to touch down at the end. And then I'm going to go in and draw my bow. So I'm going to slowly pipe a circle. Now I want to squeeze a little bit harder so the icing comes down out the cookie, because when you're doing a small circle, you don't really want to drag the icing, because if you drag it too much, you will lose control of that circle. So you kind of give it a little bit of extra push in the bag and it will fall what you want to go. Now before you do this step where I'm drawing the little lines on the white ribbon, you want to make sure that this is really nice and dry. It shouldn't take too long because it is stiffer icing. It won't take as long as a flood, but it probably still needs like a good hour or two, maybe in front of a fan, just to make sure. Every area is different, so sometimes it dries quicker or not, but I have this very fine marker and it'll poke through the icing if it's not fully dry, or it'll actually cut through that line of icing. So I want to make sure that it's nice and dry. I've linked this pen. It's my favorite black pen to use because it has a fine tip and a thick tip. So I've linked it down below the video in the description. And adding this little detail makes the ribbon really pop, and it gives it that cute little look, and it really ties the whole present together. And I just finish off with a couple of diagonal lines here, just across the ribbon. And there you have it. There's your present cookie. Okay, this next cookie here is another greenery cookie, and this is kind of the stuff that I always like to see on fireplaces or mantles or tables. So that's where I got the inspiration for this cookie. So here I have a longer, thinner cookie, and it's an interesting shape. Has some curves and some points. So I always touch down, especially on the corners or the points. And then these bubbles on the side, I want to make sure I over exaggerate them with my outline. So you can see I'm kind of touching down on the inside, because I really want those bubbles to stand out. And so if I bring my outline a little bit inward, then the flood will stay more separated at those points, and it'll really accentuate those rounded edges there. So here I'm just going with my flood again. And then I'm going to let it crust over, let it dry. It doesn't have to be fully dry, but dry enough that I can do details without ruining the icing. And here you can see I'm using my brown outline consistency. My icing kind of broke there. No problem, just go back in right over it. We're going to hide that so you won't see it. And again, I'm going to go in with my stiff green outline consistency to make little leaves or branches, I guess, or needles. Whatever you want to call it. You can go in a V if it's more comfortable, or you can go line by line on each side. And then I'm going to go in with my light green outline consistency, and I'm going to do the pressure piping here. So I'm doing pressure in one spot and then pulling down, just to give the cookie a little bit more interest and detail. And then I'm going to continue on with my darker green again. And I'm going to alternate these throughout the cookie and keep layering and adding details until I'm happy with it. This pressure piping is great. You can see, I use it in the pine cone. I'm using it in the greenery for leaves. Once you get a hang of this, pressuring and then pulling the icing down and getting that little motion, you can use it in so many different ways and so many different cookies. It's a real versatile trick to know. And of course, I'm going to add a little bit of holly as well. So I'm going to add a few dots of red outline consistency here and there, and that'll finish off this cookie for us. And last but not least, we have our leaf branch cookie. So they're all kind of similar styles. but we're using them in different ways. And so here I'm going to outline my, I think this is an oak leaf cutter, and I love this cutter. You can do so many different things with it. I had this in my Thanksgiving video, and now it's in a Christmas. You can make it into a spring kind of cookie. You can do whatever you want with it. So here I'm just going really slowly. I'm keeping my bag pretty close to the cookie. Sometimes my line doesn't go quite to the edge, and I like to have my full cookie covered. And so I can scrape it off and restart again. And then I'm going to go in and flood my cookie as usual. I like to flood as close and almost over the outline a little bit, just to hide that outline. When you first start out, little things like hiding your outline or getting, too thick of an outline or not going to the edge of the cookie, that's totally normal. It takes practice and it won't always come out perfectly. But as you go and you do more cookies, you learn the tricks and how to get right up to the edge, and you get comfortable with the pressure in your bag. You get comfortable with how to, pipe lines and where to stop and where to curve and things like that. So this is a good set because you're using a lot of little details, and it gives you the feel for the bag, and to work with stiffer icing and do those tiny details that make your sets like wow. Now I'm going to take my brown outline consistency and draw a line down the middle here. This is our guideline and going to be our stem. And then I'm going to take my green outline consistency, and we're going to do the same idea that we did with the other cookies, except we're going to do longer lines. So you can see sometimes the icing doesn't stick down, and so I just kind of pick it up and put it back if I can. Sometimes it breaks on me, so you can see lots of times my icing isn't perfect, but if you go too thin or then it's not good. So you kind of have to play around with it, and don't worry about, little things like this. You kind of just keep going, make it work. And so here I'm just adding a few branches. So some are longer needles, some are shorter needles, and I'm just going to follow the lines of the cookies or the shape of the cookie. And you can add as many or as little branches as you want. So those cutters, things that you can use in multiple sets or do multiple designs with, are always great to have. And always we're going to finish off with some holly with my red outline consistency. We want the outline because we want those little balls or little dots to stay their shapes and not run together, make one big blob. And it's so nice how a little detail works so well. And there you have it. We have our little holly branch cookie. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll list all the information down below in the video, under the video in the description. And if you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and happy baking!